The door was open, not wide, just enough to feel wrong. A thin line of light cut across the dark hotel hallway carpet, spilling from inside the honeymoon suite into the silence beyond. No voices, no movement, just that narrow crack where the world had already changed forever. He stopped walking. At first, his brain refused to understand what he was seeing. His hand tightened around the key card. He stared at the door like it might fix itself if he waited long enough. It didn't. He pushed it open. The smell hit him first. Not blood. Not yet. Something colder. Metallic. Broken. The room looked disturbed in a way no celebration ever should. Rose petals crushed into the carpet. Champagne spilled across the nightstand. A glass shattered beside the bed. And her. She was lying on the floor in her wedding dress. Not moving. For a moment, he thought she was unconscious. That she had fainted. That there was some explanation that still belonged to the world he understood. He called her name. No response. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't control them. Her skin felt colder than it should have. Her arm bent at an angle that made no sense. He searched for a pulse. Nothing. His brain began breaking apart in slow motion. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. 7 hours earlier, she had walked toward him smiling. 7 hours earlier, she had promised forever. Now forever was over. He called her name again, louder this time. Still nothing. That was the moment his life split into two parts. Before the door, and after it. He grabbed his phone, barely able to see through the tears filling his eyes, and dialed the only number that mattered. Emergency services answered calmly, professionally. Their voice belonged to a world where things could still be fixed. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out correctly. His wife wasn't breathing. His wife wasn't moving. His wife had been alive less than an hour ago, and now she wasn't. He began CPR with trembling hands, counting compressions through sobs that wouldn't stop. His entire body shook with each attempt to force life back into someone who had already slipped beyond reach. He begged her. He begged whatever force governed the universe. He begged time itself to reverse. But nothing answered. Outside, the hallway remained silent. Inside, something irreversible had already happened. And somewhere in that same building, the man responsible was still walking free. What made this moment so devastating wasn't just the loss. It was the betrayal. Because the person who destroyed her life had stood beside them hours earlier. Smiling, clapping, celebrating, pretending. Someone she trusted. Someone he trusted. Someone who had watched everything unfold from only a few feet away. The damage wasn't random. It was personal, deliberate, and it had been building for years. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. To them, this was procedure. Assess airway. Check pulse. Begin advanced intervention. But even before the equipment was unpacked, before the oxygen mask touched her face, before the four-line pierced her skin, they already knew. Her injuries told the truth no one wanted to accept. There had been a struggle, violence, fear. Her wedding dress, once pristine, now torn. Her body marked by resistance. She had fought. She had tried to survive. And in the end, she had lost. The official time of death would later be recorded with clinical precision. But the real moment she was taken from the world had happened earlier. In silence, behind a locked door, while her husband sat only floors below, laughing, celebrating, completely unaware that everything he loved was already gone. In the hours that followed, the hotel transformed. What had been a place of celebration became a crime scene. Police tape replaced wedding decorations. Strangers in gloves walked where newlyweds should have stood. Every surface was examined. Every detail documented. Because somewhere in that room was the story of how this had happened. And more importantly, who had done it. There were no signs of forced entry. The door wasn't broken. The lock wasn't damaged. She had opened it herself, which meant she had known the person standing on the other side. She had trusted them enough to let them in. And that realization narrowed the truth to something far more disturbing. This wasn't the act of a stranger. This was someone close, someone familiar, someone who had been part of their lives long before this night. Investigators would later discover something else. A window of time. Just 30 minutes. 30 minutes where everything changed. 30 minutes where someone entered that room. 30 minutes where someone left. 30 minutes where a life was destroyed. And inside that small space of time, one person couldn't fully account for where they had been. Not at first, not clearly, not honestly, but suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof, and proof was already waiting, hidden in places most people never think about. Security cameras, fingerprints, DNA, tiny fragments of truth that couldn't lie. Because unlike people, evidence doesn't forget. Downstairs, guests still lingered in the hotel. Some laughing, some drinking, some unaware, others already beginning to sense something was wrong. Whispers spread quietly at first. An ambulance, police, an emergency. But no one yet understood the scale of what had happened. No one yet understood that a wedding had become a homicide, that a promise had become a crime scene, that a best friend had already crossed a line that could never be undone. What investigators didn't know yet, what no one knew yet, was that the truth had been building long before that door opened. Long before the wedding, long before the engagement, long before the moment anyone realized they were in danger. Because betrayal like this doesn't begin in a single night. It begins quietly, in small moments, in unnoticed resentment, in silent obsession, in the slow transformation of trust into something far more dangerous. And by the time anyone sees it clearly, it's already too late. The most disturbing part wasn't how quickly everything ended. It was how normal everything had seemed just hours before. Because nothing about that day suggested what was coming. No warnings anyone took seriously. No alarms anyone recognized. Just smiles, celebration, trust. The kind of trust that makes betrayal possible. Somewhere in that hotel, someone was pretending nothing had happened. Pretending to grieve. Pretending to be shocked. Pretending to be innocent. But the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. And when it finally surfaced, it would destroy far more than just one life. Because the person responsible wasn't just anyone. It was someone who had stood beside them. Someone who had watched them promise forever. Someone who had waited, patiently, quietly, for this exact moment. And when investigators finally uncovered why, the motive would be more disturbing than anyone imagined. Not money, not revenge, not anger. Something far more personal. Something far more dangerous. Something that had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Because the real story didn't begin with her death. It began 3 years earlier. With a single introduction. A single glance. A single decision. A moment that seemed meaningless at the time, but would eventually lead to a locked door. A broken promise. And a life that ended before it ever truly began. By the time detectives arrived, the hallway had already begun to change. Uniformed officers stood at both ends, blocking access. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance to the suite. The soft patterned carpet, designed to feel luxurious and forgettable, was now frozen in memory. Every person who stepped onto that floor would remember it for the rest of their lives. Inside the room, nothing moved, but everything spoke. The bed remained untouched, rose petals arranged in a heart that would never serve its purpose. The champagne still cold. The glasses never finished. The celebration had stopped mid-breath. Detective Lisa Rodriguez stood just inside the doorway, her eyes moving slowly across the scene. 12 years in violent crimes had taught her something most people never learn. The truth rarely hides. It waits, patiently, in the details no one else notices. She didn't rush forward. She never did. Rushing meant missing something. And something had happened here that wasn't random. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken lock. No splinterdor frame. Whoever entered that room hadn't needed to break in. They had been allowed inside. That realization changed everything, because it meant the victim had trusted them, even in her final moments. Downstairs, the hotel bar was nearly empty now. A few wedding guests remained, their laughter quieter, uncertain. News had already begun spreading in fragments. Something happened upstairs. An ambulance. Police. No one knew the full truth yet. Not officially. But fear moves faster than facts. At the far end of the bar, a group of men sat in silence. Their tuxedo jackets were gone. Their ties loosened. Their expressions hollow. Hours earlier, they had been celebrating. Now they were witnesses. And one of them was something else entirely. Detective Rodriguez would later learn that the groom had been here. From 11:12 p.m. until 11:43 p.m., security cameras confirmed it. The footage showed him laughing, drinking, checking his watch, completely unaware that his wife was already fighting for her life upstairs. He never left the bar. Not once. His alibi was airtight, which meant the answer wasn't here. Not entirely, but it was close, because security footage showed something else. Something smaller. Something easy to overlook. At 11:20 p.m., one of the groomsmen stood up. He walked away from the group. Alone. The camera captured him clearly. His posture calm. His pace steady. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look rushed. He looked like someone going exactly where he intended to go. And for 17 minutes, he disappeared. 17 minutes. It didn't sound like much. But detectives knew better. 17 minutes was enough. Enough to enter a room. Enough to destroy a life. Enough to return and pretend nothing had happened. What mattered wasn't just where he went. What mattered was why. Back upstairs, forensic technicians worked methodically. They photographed everything. Every surface. Every angle. Every silent witness. They found fingerprints. They found biological evidence beneath her fingernails. Evidence of resistance. Evidence that she had fought, that she had tried to survive. And in that evidence was the beginning of the truth, because the human body remembers, even when the victim cannot speak. Downstairs, detectives began interviews. Each guest told the same story. The wedding had been beautiful. The couple had been happy. There had been no arguments. No tensión. No warning. Except for one thing. Something small. Something subtle, something that hadn't meant anything at the time, but meant everything now. One guest remembered seeing him earlier that night, standing alone, watching the bride, not speaking, not smiling, just watching. At the time, it had seemed harmless. Now it didn't. The groom sat alone in a private room, his tuxedo still stained with the memory of the night that should have been his beginning. Instead, it had become his end. Detective Rodriguez studied him carefully. Grief has patterns. Shock has patterns. And lies have patterns. His grief was real, raw, uncontrolled. He wasn't pretending, which meant someone else was. Someone who had stood confirming beside him. Someone who had toasted their future. Someone who had smiled in photographs. Someone who had watched them say their vows. And waited. Upstairs, the hallway remained frozen in silence. But the truth was already moving, quietly, through fingerprints, through timestamps, through decisions someone believed would never be discovered. Detective Rodriguez had seen cases like this before. Not identical, but familiar, because violence born from obsession doesn't appear suddenly. It grows, slowly, in silence, fed by proximity. Fed by rejection, fed by the belief that patience earns ownership. And somewhere in this investigation, that pattern was beginning to emerge. There was one question detectives kept returning to. Why had she opened the door? At that hour? Alone? Still in her wedding dress? She hadn't been expecting danger. She had been expecting someone she trusted. Someone she knew. Someone she never believed could hurt her. And that realization narrowed the truth to something deeply disturbing. Because the most dangerous person in her life was never a stranger. What investigators didn't know yet, what no one knew yet, was that this story hadn't started at the hotel. It hadn't started at the wedding. It hadn't even started with the engagement. It had started years earlier, with a friendship, with loyalty, with trust, the kind of trust people never question, the kind that makes betrayal invisible, until it's too late. And when detectives finally uncovered what had been building beneath the surface, they would realize this wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of patience, a crime of obsession, a crime that had been waiting to happen long before anyone saw it coming. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone believes is family. Long before the wedding, long before the honeymoon suite, long before the unanswered questions, there was trust, the kind of trust built slowly over years, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, unquestioned, unchallenged, unexamined. Terrence met him when they were both children. They lived on the same street, walked the same sidewalks, shared the same invisible boundaries that defined childhood observation, school, neighborhood courts, familiar faces. At first, there was nothing unusual about their friendship. They were just boys, growing up, learning who they were, learning who they weren't. Terrence had always been the easier one to know. People gravitated toward him without effort. He laughed easily, spoke confidently, made others feel included without trying. He belonged everywhere he went. Cameron did not. He existed beside Terrence, never fully separate, but never fully equal. It wasn't something anyone said aloud, but it was understood. Even then, friendships like theirs create invisible roles. One leads, one follows, one is seen, one watches. At first, those roles feel harmless, comforting even, but over time, they shape identity. And identity shapes expectation. Cameron learned early that Terrence had something he didn't. Ease, acceptance, opportunity. It wasn't jealousy. Not yet. It was awareness, reinforced over years of watching Terrence succeed where he struggled. Terrence dated easily. Cameron didn't. Terrence built relationships effortlessly. Cameron analyzed every interaction, searching for meaning, searching for mistakes, searching for reasons. He didn't understand why connection came naturally to some people and not others. He didn't understand why effort wasn't enough. But he believed effort mattered. He believed patience mattered. He believed proximity mattered. And he believed, eventually, those things would be rewarded. Years later, their lives had begun to separate. Terrence had built stability, a career, a future. Cameron had built routine, predictable, controlled, solitary. He worked long shifts, returned home alone, repeated the same patterns, the same meals, the same silence. Control became his comfort. Because control meant safety. Control meant certainty. Control meant protection from rejection. Then came the fundraiser. At the time, it didn't seem important. It was just another evening. Another room full of strangers pretending to be comfortable. Another opportunity to exist unnoticed. Until he saw her. She wasn't trying to stand out. She didn't need to. She moved through the room with quiet confidence. Comfortable in her own presence. Comfortable in her own identity. She wasn't performing. She was simply being. And for the first time in years, Cameron felt possibility. He studied her without realizing he was studying her. The way she listened, the way she spoke, the way others responded to her. He didn't approach immediately. He waited, watched, prepared, because preparation made outcomes predictable. Preparation prevented failure. Preparation created control. And this time, he intended to succeed. He had planned everything carefully. What he would say, how he would introduce himself, how he would create connection. It wasn't manipulation, not in his mind. It was strategy. It was effort. It was earning opportunity. But before he could act, something happened. Terrence arrived. Unexpected, unplanned, unnecessary, and everything changed. Not gradually, not subtly, immediately. Because the moment she saw Terrence, her attention shifted, not toward effort, not toward preparation, toward presence, toward ease, toward him. Cameron watched it happen in real time. The moment possibility disappeared, the moment control was lost, the moment he became invisible again. He didn't interrupt. He didn't protest. He didn't reveal anything. He simply observed. And observation became memory. Memory became interpretation. Interpretation became belief. Belief became something else entirely. Because in Cameron's mind, this wasn't coincidence. This wasn't chance. This was loss. Loss of something he believed had been his to earn. Something taken before he had been allowed to claim it. That belief changed nothing externally. But internally, it changed everything. Terrence never knew. He couldn't, because Cameron never told him. Instead, he adapted. He remained present, supportive, explained correct. He attended dinners, celebrations, conversations. He smiled when expected, spoke when necessary, watched constantly, learning, measuring, enduring. Because proximity meant possibility. Possibility meant hope. And hope meant control hadn't been lost entirely. Not yet. As their relationship grew, Cameron remained. Not distant, not separate, integrated, accepted, trusted. He became part of their lives in ways that felt permanent, expected, safe. He attended birthdays, holidays, private moments never meant to be witnessed by outsiders. But Cameron was no longer an outsider. He was family. At least, that's what Terrence believed. Trust is built on repetition, repeated presence, repeated loyalty, repeated reliability. And Cameron had mastered all three, which made what came later possible. Because betrayal doesn't require access. It requires trust. And trust had already been given. Freely, completely, irrevocably. Detectives would later examine this period closely, searching, confirming for warning signs, moments that could have changed the outcome. But warning signs rarely look dangerous at the time. They look normal, harmless, forgettable, until viewed through the lens of what came later. Only then do they become visible. Only then do they become undeniable. Only then does the pattern emerge. The foundation had been built long before anyone realized they were standing on it. Built through friendship, built through trust, built through proximity, built through silence. And beneath that foundation, something had already begun to crack. Not visibly, not audibly, but permanently. Because while Terrence believed he had gained a brother, Cameron believed he had lost something far more important. Something he never believed he would recover. And from that moment forward, everything that followed was shaped by that loss. Even the wedding, even the celebration, even the trust that allowed the door to open. Because the most dangerous decisions aren't made in moments of rage. They're made in moments of certainty. Moments where someone convinces themselves they deserve something they were never given. The proposal happened on a night that felt ordinary. Cold air, city lights reflecting against glass. Nothing about it suggested permanence. Nothing about it suggested danger. Only possibility. Terrence had spent weeks planning it. Not obsessively, not perfectly, just enough to make it meaningful. He wasn't trying to create spectacle. He was trying to create certainty. When he asked her to marry him, his voice trembled. Not from doubt, from understanding. He understood what he was asking. He understood what he was promising. And when she said yes, everything in his life aligned in a way it never had before. Stability, future, home. He wasn't gaining something temporary. He was gaining something permanent. And he wanted to share that permanence with the person who had always been there. Cameron. When Terrence told him the news, Cameron responded exactly as expected. He congratulated him. He smiled. He embraced him. He said all the right words. Because Cameron understood roles. He understood expectations. He understood performance. And he performed perfectly. But performance is not the same as acceptance. Inside, something shifted. Not suddenly, not violently, but definitively, because engagement changed everything. It removed uncertainty, removed possibility, removed hope, and replaced it with permanence. She wasn't someone he might eventually have. She was someone he would never have, ever. And permanence has consequences. Psychological consequences. Emotional consequences. Consequences that don't reveal themselves immediately. They build, quietly, beneath the surface. The wedding planning began quickly. Venues, dates, guest lists, details. Each decision moved the future closer. Each decision removed ambiguity. Each decision reinforced reality. And Cameron was present for all of it, not as an outsider, as a participant. He helped review locations, offered opinions, provided support. He was trusted, included, valued, because that's what best friends are. That's what brothers do. And Terrence never questioned it. Why would he? Trust had never betrayed him before. What no one realized was how access changes perception. Access removes barriers, removes distance, removes protection. Cameron wasn't imagining their life. He was witnessing it in real time, watching intimacy, watching affection, watching connection, observing moments never meant to be analyzed. But analysis became unavoidable because Cameron didn't just see their relationship. He studied it, not consciously, not deliberately, but constantly, searching for flaws, searching for weakness, searching for explanation, trying to understand why Terrence had succeeded where he had not, trying to understand what made Terrence worthy, and him invisible. The closer the wedding approached, the more Cameron's role expanded. Terrence asked him to be best man without hesitation, without doubt, without suspicion. It was the highest honor he could offer, and Cameron accepted immediately, because acceptance granted access, unrestricted, unquestioned. Belmano. He wasn't just attending the wedding. He was part of it, standing beside him, witnessing every moment, from beginning to end, closer than anyone else, closer than family, closer than anyone realized. The rehearsal dinner took place the night before the ceremony. It was small, intimate, safe. Family and friends gathered in a controlled environment designed to celebrate unity. Cameron delivered a speech that night, carefully constructed, carefully measured. He spoke about loyalty, about friendship, about history. He said everything expected of him, nothing more, nothing less. But beneath the words, something else existed, something invisible, something no one recognized. Because words don't always reveal intention. Sometimes they conceal it. And Cameron had spent years learning how to conceal his. The wedding day arrived without warning. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became ceremony. Ceremony became permanence. Terrence stood at the altar waiting, breathing, anticipating. Cameron stood beside him, close enough to hear his breathing, close enough to hear his heartbeat, close enough to witness everything. When she appeared, walking toward them, Cameron felt something he had never experienced before. Finality, not loss. Not yet. Finality, because loss implies something that might be recovered. Finality does not. Finality means irreversible. Belmano. Complete. The ceremony unfolded exactly as planned. Vows exchanged, rings placed, promises made, legally binding, socially recognized, emotionally irreversible. Cameron performed his role flawlessly. He held the ring when needed, stepped forward when instructed, stepped back when required. Invisible, essential, trusted, because trust had never been broken before. Not yet. The reception followed. Music, laughter, movement, celebration. Terrence and Jasmine danced together. Natural, comfortable, certain. Cameron watched from a distance, close enough to observe, far enough to remain unnoticed. He drank slowly, carefully, not enough to lose control, enough to soften the edge of reality, because reality had become something difficult to endure. Not painful. Not exactly. Permanent. And permanence has weight. Psychological weight. Emotional weight. Weight that accumulates over time until it becomes unbearable. No one noticed anything unusual. No one suspected anything dangerous. Because Cameron didn't behave dangerously. He behaved normally, helpfully, reliably, exactly as expected. And that was the most dangerous part. Because the greatest threats rarely announce themselves. They integrate, adapt, disappear into trust, until trust becomes vulnerability, and vulnerability becomes opportunity. The night progressed. The celebration continued. The future solidified, and Cameron remained exactly where he had always been, beside them, trusted, accepted, invisible, waiting, not consciously, not deliberately, but inevitably, because some decisions aren't made in moments. They're made over years, reinforced through repetition, strengthened through proximity, until action becomes inevitable, until opportunity appears, until the door opens. And when that opportunity finally came, no one was prepared for what he would do. By the time the reception reached its peak, the room had begun to change. Not visibly, not in ways anyone could name, but in ways people could feel. Celebrations have a rhythm. They rise, they hold, and eventually they begin to fall. The formalities were complete. The vows had been spoken. The future had been secured. What remained was ritual, dancing, drinking, closure. For most people, this was the happiest part. For Cameron, it was something else. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the life he had watched from the outside was no longer theoretical. It was permanent, real, untouchable. He stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching Terrence and Jasmine move together with effortless familiarity. They didn't perform affection. They existed inside it. Their proximity wasn't forced. It was natural, instinctive, permanent. And permanence has consequences. Because permanence removes possibility. It removes uncertainty. It removes hope. Cameron lifted his glass and drank slowly. Alcohol didn't create his thoughts. It removed the distance between him and them, lowered resistance, softened restraint, made reality harder to ignore. He wasn't drunk. Not yet. He was aware. Aware of where he stood. Aware of what he had lost. Aware of what would never change. Around him, laughter filled the room. Voices overlapping. Music pulsing. Movement everywhere. But Cameron remained still. Stillness inside chaos. Observation inside celebration. Isolation inside belonging. Because proximity does not guarantee connection. It guarantees exposure. Exposure to what cannot be controlled. The best man's speech had already been delivered. His words had been careful, measured, safe. No one had questioned his sincerity. No one had questioned his loyalty. Why would they? He had never given them reason to. Trust had been built over decades. Trust that now protected him, shielded him, allowed him to remain exactly where he needed to be. Close. Close enough to see everything. Close enough to act when the moment came. Terrence approached him eventually. Relaxed, happy, unaware. He placed a hand on Cameron's shoulder. Grateful, appreciative, thankful. He thanked him for everything. For being there. For standing beside him. For being family. Cameron responded exactly as expected. He smiled. He nodded. He reassured him. Because reassurance maintained trust. Trust maintained access. Access maintained opportunity. An opportunity, once created, does not disappear. It waits. The reception began to thin as the night deepened. Older guests left first. Family members said their goodbyes. The emotional intensity of the ceremony gave way to physical exhaustion. By the time the couple prepared to leave, the celebration had softened into something quieter, something more private, something final. They exited through a tunnel of sparklers, friends and family lining the path, light flickering in the darkness. applause following them as they stepped into the future they had promised each other. Cameron stood among them, holding light, watching permanence disappear into distance. The hotel was only minutes away, close enough to feel safe, close enough to remain connected, close enough for opportunity to survive. Terrence and Jasmine entered the honeymoon suite shortly after arriving. Together, alone, protected, or so they believed. Downstairs, the hotel bar remained open. A final ritual for the groomsmen. A final transition between ceremony and aftermath. Cameron sat among them, silent, present, watching Terrence check his phone, watching Terrence hesitate, watching Terrence decide, because decisions create vulnerability, and vulnerability creates openings. Terrence returned upstairs briefly, then came back down, just long enough for everything to change. Time passed differently now, measured not in minutes, but in proximity, in distance, in opportunity. Cameron watched the elevator doors open and close, watched movement, watched patterns, watched isolation form around someone who believed she was safe, because safety is often an illusion created by familiarity, not reality. Reality is shaped by decision, and Cameron was approaching a decision he had been building toward for years, not consciously, not deliberately, but inevitably, because psychological pressure does not disappear. It accumulates until release becomes unavoidable. He stood slowly. No one questioned him. No one followed him. No one noticed anything unusual, because nothing appeared unusual. That was the power of trust, the power of expectation, the power of invisibility. He walked toward the elevators, his pace steady, controlled, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, certain, because certainty removes fear. Certainty replaces doubt. Certainty allows action. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside, pressed the button, and waited. No one else entered. No one interrupted him. No one stopped him. The doors closed. And in that moment, everything that followed became inevitable. Upstairs, she was alone, trusting, unaware, safe, or so she believed. The knock would come soon. A simple sound, familiar, harmless, a confirmation of trust, because the most dangerous threats never force entry. They are invited inside, and when the door opened, the life she had just begun would end. The hallway was silent, not the comfortable silence of rest, the kind that follows completion. This silence was different, expectant, holding something unfinished. He stepped out of the elevator and paused. The carpet absorbed the sound of his movement. The lighting remained soft, indifferent confirmation to everything unfolding beneath it. Room 412 stood at the end of the corridor, still, waiting. Inside, she believed she was alone. She had removed her shoes. The unfamiliar quiet of the room settling around her after the noise of the reception. Her body ached from hours of standing, smiling, celebrating. Her life had changed that day. She was no longer who she had been that morning. She was someone new, someone promised, someone protected, or so she believed. Then came the knock. 3 soft impacts against the door. Familiar, ordinary, safe. She smiled instinctively. He must have forgotten something. His key, his phone, some small detail left behind in excitement. She walked to the door without hesitation, without fear, because trust eliminates fear. She opened it and saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Recognition came first, then confusion, then something else, something harder to name. He stood differently, not relaxed, not familiar. His presence filled the doorway in a way it never had before. She asked a question, a simple one. Was everything okay? He didn't answer. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between them, closing the space that had always existed, closing the boundary trust had created. She stepped back instinctively, not from recognition, from instinct, because something inside her understood what her mind had not yet accepted. This wasn't normal. This wasn't safe. This wasn't the person she thought she knew. He spoke quietly, not with anger, not with urgency, with certainty, the kind of certainty that forms over time, the kind of certainty that cannot be undone. He told her things she didn't understand, things that had lived only in his mind, interpretations, beliefs, conclusions drawn without her knowledge, without her participation, without her consent. She tried to interrupt, tried to correct him, tried to restore reality. But reality had already fractured, because his reality no longer required her agreement. It required her presence, her acknowledgement, her validation, things she could never give, things she would never give. She told him to leave, not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly. She told him this wasn't appropriate, that this wasn't the time, that this wasn't the place, that this wasn't something she wanted. Rejection, direct, unavoidable, irreversible, and rejection, when it collides with entitlement, creates something dangerous. Not immediately, but inevitably. The fracture had begun long before this moment. Years earlier, built through silence, strengthened through proximity, protected by trust. Now it revealed itself fully, not as confusion, not as sadness, but as certainty. His certainty. Her refusal did not change his belief, because belief, once hardened, resists reality, resists truth, resists rejection. She moved toward the phone, toward distance, toward escape. He moved faster, closing the space between intention and prevention. She struggled, resisted, fought, not with strength alone, but with survival, because survival does not negotiate. It reacts, instinctively, desperately. Human beings fight hardest when they understand what is being taken from them. Not life, not yet. Control, safety, choice. She fought for all three. Time lost meaning inside that room. Moments stresha, compressed, fragmented. Outside, the building remained unchanged. Elevators moved. Lights flickered. Guests slept. Reality continued uninterrupted. Inside, reality ended. Not in a single moment, but in stages. Trust disappeared first. Then safety. Then protection. Then everything else. When it was over, silence returned. But it was not the same silence. It was heavier. Final. He stood there breathing, listening, waiting. Not for her. For himself. For confirmation. For resolution. For something that would restore what had never truly existed. But nothing did, because actions do not restore illusion. They destroy it, confirming, irrevocably. He left the room, not running, not hiding, walking, returning to where he had been before, returning to performance, returning to invisibility, because invisibility had always protected him, protected his thoughts, protected his beliefs, protected his actions. Until now, downstairs, the bar remained open. Conversation continued. Glasses remained filled. Terrence was still there, waiting, trusting, believing his life had just begun. He didn't know it had already ended. Not yet, but soon, very soon, because upstairs, the door remained open, and nothing inside would ever be the same again. Downstairs, nothing had changed. Laughter still drifted through the hotel bar. Glasses still touched the counter in soft, forgettable sounds. Conversations overlapped without meaning. Terrence sat among them, existing inside a future he believed was waiting for him upstairs. He checked his phone. No new messages. He smiled faintly to himself. She was probably changing, probably standing in front of the mirror, removing the careful construction of the day, becoming herself again, becoming his wife in the quiet way that mattered more than ceremony. He finished his drink and stood. He didn't announce his departure. He didn't need to. He simply nodded to the man beside him and turned toward the elevators, because he had somewhere he belonged now, somewhere permanent, somewhere safe. The elevator doors opened with mechanical indifference. He stepped inside, pressed the button, waited. The ride upward felt shorter than it was. His reflection stared back at him from the metal surface. His tie loosened, his expression softer than it had ever been before. He was no longer a fiancé. He was a husband. He stepped out onto the 4th floor. The hallway stretched ahead of him in perfect stillness. Then he saw it. The door. Open. Not wide. Just enough. Enough to interrupt expectation. Enough to interrupt certainty. Enough to interrupt everything. He slowed, his mind searching for explanation. There were reasonable explanations. She could have stepped out briefly. She could have forgotten to close it. She could be inside, safe, waiting. He reached the door, pushed it open, and the future ended. The room was wrong. Everything inside him understood that before his mind could process it. The rose petals had moved. The champagne lay overturned. The silence felt unnatural, heavy. He stepped forward slowly. Then he saw her, on the floor, motionless. His body reacted before his mind did. He dropped beside her, called her name. Once, twice, again. No response. His hands shook as he reached for her. Her skin felt cold, her body unresponsive. Reality fractured. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not here. Not to her. Not to them. He called emergency services, his voice unrecognizable, breaking apart under the weight of what he was witnessing. They instructed him to perform CPR. He obeyed, pushing against her chest, counting, begging, repeating movements he had never imagined performing on her. Time lost meaning. Seconds stretched endlessly. He waited for movement, waited for breath, waited for life to return. But nothing changed. The silence remained, unbroken. Emergency responders arrived quickly, professionally, efficiently. They moved him aside gently, not roughly, not urgently, because they already knew. Their movements had changed, slowed, resigned. They continued procedure. But procedure was no longer hope. It was confirmation. Police followed soon after. The room transformed again, not into celebration, into evidence. Terence sat nearby, unmoving, uncomprehending, watching strangers move through the space where his life had existed hours earlier. They asked him questions. He answered automatically, mechanically. He told them where he had been, who he had been with, what time he had left, what time he had returned. His timeline formed clearly, consistently, verifiably. He had been downstairs, with witnesses, with cameras, with proof. He hadn't done this. He couldn't have, which meant someone else had, someone who had entered willingly, someone she had trusted, someone familiar. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline immediately, minute by minute, movement by movement. Camera by camera. They reviewed security footage, examined entry logs, interviewed witnesses, and one detail emerged quickly. A gap. 17 minutes. 17 minutes where someone had left the bar. 17 minutes where someone had not been seen. 17 minutes where everything had happened. Detectives asked the question carefully. Who had left the group? Witnesses hesitated, searching memory, reconstructing sequence. Then someone answered. The best man. He had stood. He had walked away. He had said he was going to the restroom. But no one had seen him enter it. No one had seen him return immediately. Because he hadn't. He had disappeared for exactly 17 minutes. And in those 17 minutes, a life had ended. Upstairs, forensic teams continued working, collecting, documenting, preserving truth in physical form. Because physical truth cannot lie. It cannot forget. It cannot protect anyone. It simply exists, waiting to be understood, waiting to be matched, waiting to reveal who had destroyed everything. Downstairs, Cameron had already returned, already resumed his place, already resumed his role, already resumed his performance. He spoke carefully, moved carefully, reacted carefully, because performance had always protected him. But performance cannot erase evidence. And evidence had already begun speaking, quietly, irrevocably, and soon it would say his name, because some decisions cannot be undone, some actions cannot be hidden, some betrayals cannot remain invisible. And the man Terrence had trusted more than anyone else was about to become the center of everything. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It arrived in fragments. Quiet, clinical, unemotional, because truth does not care about consequences. It only exists. Detective Rodriguez sat in the hotel security office, watching the footage again. She had already seen it once, then twice. Now she watched it frame by frame. The screen showed the hotel bar. Terrence sitting with the groomsmen, laughing, unaware, alive inside a moment already lost. Then, at exactly 11:20 p.m., Cameron stood. No hositación, no announcement. He simply rose and walked out of frame. Rodriguez leaned forward, watching carefully, waiting. The next camera showed the hallway outside the bar. He appeared seconds later, walking alone, toward the elevators, his pace steady, his posture controlled, not confused, not distracted, intentional. The footage continued. Elevator doors opening, elevator doors closing. Then nothing. No cameras inside the elevator. No cameras on the fourth-floor corridor. A gap. 17 minutes. 17 minutes where Cameron existed outside observation, outside documentation, outside accountability. Then, at 11:37 p.m., he returned. Same pace, same posture, same calm exterior. He re-entered the bar, resumed his seat, resumed his role, resumed his performance. As if nothing had happened, detectives began interviewing him formally hours later. He appeared cooperative, calm, controlled. He answered questions without hesitation. He told them he had gone to the restroom. He told them he had needed air. He told them nothing unusual had happened. His voice never trembled. His hands never shook. His story never changed. But experienced investigators understand something most people don't. Truth remains consistent, but so does deception. Consistency does not confirm innocence. It confirms preparation. The physical evidence arrived next. Fingerprint analysis confirmed what proximity had already suggested. His prints were present, inside the room, on surfaces he had no reason to touch. DNA evidence followed, recovered from beneath her fingernails. Her final attempt to resist had preserved the truth. Her body had recorded what her voice could no longer say. Scientific evidence removed interpretation, removed speculation, removed doubt. Because science does not guess, it confirms. Rodriguez reviewed the findings in silence. She had seen this pattern before. Not identical, but familiar. Crimes built on proximity, enabled by trust, executed under illusion of invisibility. He hadn't planned every detail, but he had planned enough. Enough to believe he would never be questioned. Enough to believe trust would protect him. Enough to believe proximity granted immunity. But proximity does the opposite. It narrows possibility, narrows suspects, narrows truth, until only one explanation remains. Detectives observed him carefully during subsequent interactions. Not just his words, his behavior, because behavior reveals what words conceal. He asked questions, but not the right questions. He expressed concern, but not naturally. His reactions appeared correct, but not authentic. He performed grief. He performed shock. He performed loyalty. But performance always contains flaws. Small inconsistencies, small delays, small absences of genuine emotional response. Enough for trained observers to recognize the difference between grief and imitation. Terrence remained unaware of the truth forming around him. He believed his friend shared his pain, shared his loss, shared his devastation. He leaned on Cameron, trusted him, needed him, because Cameron had always been there, always reliable, always present. Always family. That was the cruelest part. The betrayal did not end with the crime. It continued afterward. In comfort, in reassurance, in proximity, because Cameron stood beside him even then, watching him suffer, knowing why. The arrest came quietly, not dramatic, not public. Early morning, officers approached him calmly, informed him of the charges. He did not resist, did not argue, did not confess. He simply listened, because denial remained his final form of control. But control had already been lost. The evidence had spoken, irrevocably. Trust had protected him once. Now it had exposed him, because trust had given him access. And access had given him opportunity. And opportunity had created evidence. Evidence he could never erase. Evidence that had waited patiently. Just like he had. Terrence would later learn the truth. Not immediately, not gently, but completely. And in that moment, he would lose more than his wife. He would lose his past, his certainty, his ability to trust his own memories. Because the man he had called brother had never been who he believed he was. And the most terrifying realization wasn't what Cameron had done. It was how long he had been waiting to do it. In the days that followed, silence became permanent. Not the silence of peace, the silence of absence. The hotel reopened its doors to new guests within 48 hours. The hallway was vacuumed. The room was cleaned. The physical evidence removed. But places remember, not structurally, psychologically, because violence leaves behind something that cannot be erased. Memory. And memory survives longer than evidence ever will. Terrence returned home alone. The tuxedo still hung where he left it. The wedding gifts remained unopened. Cards filled with congratulations sat in careful stacks, each one addressed to both of them, each one written for a future that no longer existed. He couldn't bring himself to open them, because opening them would confirm what his mind still refused to accept, that she was never coming back. Grief changed everything, not immediately. At first, it arrived as shock, disbelief, confusion. Terrence replayed the night endlessly. Every decision, every moment, every choice. He thought about the text message, the invitation to the bar, the 15 minutes he believed were harmless. He wondered what would have happened if he had stayed, if he had ignored the message, if he had chosen differently. But grief creates questions without answers. Because the truth was never about those 15 minutes. It was about years. Years of trust. Years of proximity. Years of believing someone was family, when they were something else entirely. The investigation continued, but its conclusion was inevitable. DNA evidence confirmed Cameron's presence. Fingerprint analysis confirmed his contact. Security footage confirmed his movement. His timeline collapsed under the weight of physical reality. He had been there. He had entered willingly. He had left alone, and he had returned to pretend nothing had happened. Detectives presented the findings formally, methodically, emotionally detached, because emotional involvement compromises clarity. But even clarity cannot soften truth. The trial began months later. Public, documented, permanent. Cameron sat at the defense table, his appearance unchanged, controlled, careful. He wore the same expression he had worn his entire life. Neutral, unreadable. He avoided Terrence's eyes, avoided acknowledgement, avoided reality, because acknowledgement requires acceptance, and acceptance requires responsibility. Responsibility he would never willingly accept. Prosecutors presented evidence clearly, chronologically, forensically, each piece forming a structure that could not be dismantled. They showed the timeline. They showed the footage. They showed the evidence recovered from beneath her fingernails. The final proof of resistance. The final proof of truth. Defense arguments attempted to create doubt. Attempted to create alternative interpretation. Attempted to create uncertainty. But uncertainty cannot survive physical evidence. Not when it speaks clearly. Not when it confirms what cannot be undone. Terrence testified, his voice quieter than it had once been, his posture heavier, his certainty gone. He described their friendship, their history, their trust. He described asking Cameron to be best man, described believing he was family. He described the moment he found her, the moment his life ended. His words did not seek revenge. They sought understanding, understanding he would never receive, because the answer was never logical. It was psychological, built over time, hidden beneath normal behavior, protected by proximity, enabled by trust. The verdict arrived without surprise. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom. Simple. Permanent. Final. But justice does not restore what was taken. It confirms loss. It confirms damage. It confirms that nothing will ever return to what it was. Cameron showed little reaction, because reaction would require emotional recognition. Recognition he had spent years avoiding. Officers placed him in custody, removed him physically, but removal does not erase consequence. It only relocates it. Terrence did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. Justice did not bring relief. It brought finality. Finality he had already lived with since that night. Because grief does not end with verdicts. It continues, quietly, indefinitely. Years later, Terrence would still remember small details. The way she laughed when she was tired. The way she held his hand without thinking. The way she trusted the world completely. Trust without suspicion. Trust without fear. Trust that had made her vulnerable. Trust that had allowed the door to open. He never stopped asking himself the same question. Not why Cameron did it, but how he had never seen it. Because Cameron had never appeared dangerous. Never appeared unstable. Never appeared capable. He had appeared normal. And that was the most disturbing truth of all. Because the most dangerous people rarely appear dangerous. They appear familiar, reliable, trusted. They stand beside you in photographs. Celebrate your happiness. Earn your confidence. Wait patiently, quietly, until the moment opportunity appears. The hotel still exists. The room still exists. Guests still stay there, sleep there, dream there, unaware of what happened within those walls. Because life continues, indifferent to individual loss, indifferent to individual tragedy, indifferent to individual betrayal. But memory does not disappear. It lives inside people, inside absence, inside unanswered questions, inside irreversible moments. Terrence would eventually rebuild parts of his life. Not fully, not completely, because some losses do not heal. They integrate, become part of identity, part of perception, part of reality. He learned something he never wanted to learn. That betrayal does not come from strangers. It comes from people you trust most, people you never question, people you believe would protect you, until they don't. And the most disturbing part of this story isn't what happened in that room. It's what happened before. Years of friendship, years of loyalty, years of trust. None of it was real. It had only been proximity, observation, patience, waiting, because the man who destroyed everything had never needed to break in. He had always been invited.